everyone, Jean here at Studio JD. Thank you so much for joining me. Today we're going to take a look at how different mediums can change the overall look and feel of our cards. I'll be making two cards using the same colors and the same layouts, but I'll make one using ink sprays and the other using dye inks. So let's get started. For this project, I'll be using one of my favorite floral dyes from Altenew, the Fantasy Floral 3D Layering Die. This is probably my all-time favorite layering die. For the sentiment, I'll be using the Altenew One Friend mini stamp set. And for one of the layers of our cards, I'll be using pattern paper from Altenew's Wildflower 6x6 paper pack. For our die cuts, we'll be using one piece of watercolor cardstock and one of 80-pound or higher white cardstock. Both of these are 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. For dye inks, we'll be using Altenew inks in Warm Sunshine, Frosty Pink, Coral Berry, Ruby Red, Forest Glade, Evergreen, and Jet Black, which we'll use to stamp our sentiment. I'll be using some Post-it removable tape to hold my die cuts in place while I'm ink blending. For our other medium, we'll be using Altenew shimmer sprays in the same colors as our dye inks: Frosty Pink, Coral Berry, Forest Glade, Ruby Red, and Warm Sunshine. And lastly, you'll need some ink blending brushes and whatever craft mat or craft surface you prefer to use. I'm using my Altenew silicone mat. Since ink sprays require a bit of drying time, let's start by getting those ready. I'm using watercolor cardstock for this since the ink sprays are a wet medium and we'll be getting the die cuts pretty wet. I have an Anna Griffin Empress electronic die cutting machine, so I'm placing my dies and watercolor paper according to the recommendations for my machine. You'll want to be sure to use the sandwich recommendations for whatever machine you're using. I've taken this off camera and run it through my machine, and now I'm ready to spray the individual die cuts. Ink sprays can tend to be a bit messy, so I like to spray my die cuts inside a box that I've lined with paper towel and a piece of printer paper. This helps keep the spray contained and keeps my work surface clean. I'm starting out by spraying the 3 pieces that make up the flower, so I'm putting all 3 in my spray box and moving the leaves off to the side for a minute. I'm spraying all 3 pieces with Warm Sunshine in order to give them all a similar tone. Honestly, I just love it when pinks and yellows mix, so you'll get that warm and bright orangey color, and I think it's just beautiful. I don't show it here, but off screen I've thoroughly shaken my ink sprays. Since these are shimmer sprays, the shimmer materials can tend to settle to the bottom of the bottle, so shaking them up helps to get the shimmer distributed evenly. Now that all the pieces are coated with Warm Sunshine, I'm taking out the top 2 layers for the flower so I can finish up the base layer by adding a bit of Frosty Pink spray. This will give that yellow the more orangey color I'm going for. I'm also bringing in some plain water, which helps to blend the colors. Just a few more spritzes of Frosty Pink and you can start to see that it's getting just a bit more orange. I always have to remind myself that the ink spray colors will dry back or lighten when they dry. So even if it feels like the color is too intense, I try to be patient and wait until it's dry to decide. I let this dry for a little bit and decided it still looked a little too yellow, so I've added a little more Frosty Pink and some water, and I feel like now it has that orangey color that I really was looking for. I've set that piece aside, and now I'm ready to work on the second layer of the flower. For this layer, I'm going to be using the Coral Berry, and this color is one of my favorite all-time colors, so I'm spraying it with a little bit of water and then adding the Coral Berry, and you can see it is just gorgeous, bright color. I use this color all the time, but I'm always end up being surprised at how gorgeous it is. So here I'm just kind of comparing it to the first layer just to make sure that there's enough of a contrast. You can see I'm kind of going back and forth a little bit just to make sure that it has the contrast that I like. And In this case, I feel like there's plenty of contrast here. So I think I'm gonna just leave this color, this coral berry color the way it is, and set it aside and move on to the third layer. For this layer, I'm using ruby red along with more just plain water. The ruby red is going to look really, really intense when it's wet, but you just have to remember that these colors will dry back, so you can see it's really, really red. And I think that once it's mostly dry, so now I've kind of waited till it's mostly dry, and you can see it's still really, really bright, but when I hold it up against the coral berry layer, it doesn't have as much contrast as I'd like. So I put it back in. I'm gonna spray it a little bit more, let it dry again, and I think at that point it does have the contrast that I'm looking for, and I can move on to the leaves. So now I'm putting the leaves in my box. You can see I've cleaned my spray box out just to make sure that I don't get any contamination between the red and the green, and I don't end up with a muddy looking color. I'm spraying these pieces with some water and then with the Forest Glades. I've sped this up a little bit because I go back and forth several times just to make sure I'm getting some variation in the different leaves, adding the water to make it blend, adding more ink. It's really a process that you go back and forth, dry, let it dry, look again to see if it's got the variation you want, and when it does, you're good. So I've set those aside, and while those are drying, I'm ready to cut out the die cuts for the second card. For this one, I'll be using a piece of white 80-pound Nina Solar white cardstock, but any white cardstock that is at least 80 pounds should work well. I'll die cut these out just like I did the last set, except this time I'm going to try to keep the die cuts themselves in the negative piece to make it easier to ink blend. Of course, as I take these apart, not all of my pieces stayed intact, so I'm just going to set that piece aside, and then I'll turn over my entire cardstock sheet and try to make sure that my pieces are laying flat, or as flat as possible. You can see I'm struggling a little bit with this 3-leaf piece, so I'm just going to actually take that out completely. And then what I'm going to do is put Post-it tape over the back side. And you want to make sure you're doing this on the back side, and that you're using a removable tape like Post-it. I've made this mistake a couple times using regular tape or doing it on the wrong side, and trust me, it works better when you do it this way. So now I'm just going over and making sure that the pieces are in there and they're flat, and I can put back in these two pieces, these two little leaf pieces that didn't stay intact when I pulled it off of my die cutting machine. I spend a bit of time making sure that my pieces are in there and nice and flat because I'm going to be ink blending these, and I want to make sure that the edges don't catch on my blending brushes and tear or rip or tear up the die cut pieces. So I'm going to start with the Warm Sunshine again, just like I did with the sprays. And I'm going to go over all of the flower pieces, just with a little bit of that Warm Sunshine to try to give it that same tone, and then hopefully get some of that orangey color that I really like. So now that I have the Warm Sunshine the way that I like it, I'm moving on to add the Frosty Pink to the base layer or the bottom layer of the flowers. I've sped this up quite a bit because the Frosty Pink is a very, very pale pink, and it is taking several layers for me to go back and forth over the top of that yellow in order to get the color, the orangey color that I was looking for. But once I'm happy with that, I can set that aside and move on to the second layer of the flower, which I'll be using Coral Berry. I use a really light hand when I'm blending this Coral Berry, but you can see that it doesn't take much to get some really gorgeous color. The combination of the Warm Sunshine and the Coral Berry, I think this is probably my favorite color, and it just turns out just stunning when it's against the Warm Sunshine or against a darker red color. So now I'm moving on to Ruby Red, and again I'm going to use a light hand with this, and I'm going to do it on the top layer or the third layer of the flower. And even though I'm doing this very gently, you can see how bright and intense that ruby red color is. It'll look a little less intense when I put all of these pieces together, but you can see here that I've got some really great contrast between those three pieces. So here I'm removing these die cut pieces from the post-it backing and setting them aside. I use my little pokey tool to remove any of the little die cut pieces that stayed inside. And now I'm ready to start ink blending on the leaf pieces. I'm using Forest Glade dye ink, which is the same color that I used for the leaves when I sprayed them. But as I see this going on, I'm feeling like there's not a whole lot of contrast here, and I feel like the leaves just don't have the variation in them that they did when we sprayed them. So I'm going in with a little bit of evergreen ink, and I know I didn't use this color on the sprayed pieces, but I feel like this gives the leaves just a little bit more variation, so I can get the same kind of look or feel on the leaves as I did with the sprayed pieces. So now it's time for my favorite part, assembling all the pieces. So let's start with the ink sprayed pieces since they're completely dry. I use liquid glue to secure the layers because it's strong and I think it holds the best, but you should use whatever glue you like best. Just keep in mind that the watercolor paper is thicker and may have warped a tiny bit, so you'll want to use something strong to hold it. I'll start by adding glue to the back of the second layer of the flower and then positioning it on top of the first layer. I like to set it in place gently and then more firmly as I go. This is another advantage of the liquid glue because it gives me a bit of time to ensure that all the layers are lined up. And to make sure I get a good bond with the glue, I even sometimes turn it upside down and press it onto my craft mat, and I'll set a stamping block on top of it to hold it in place while I add glue to the third layer. You can see how easy this flower is to layer. It comes together so beautifully and is so easy to line up. Off camera, I use the same process to assemble the ink blended flower. So now we're ready to stamp our sentiment. For this, I'm using the Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, which I've cut down to 3.5 by 4 3/4 inches. I'm using my mini Misty stamping platform, and I start out by figuring out the layout of my card. I know I want the flower to be in the lower right corner, and this helps me see about where I want to stamp my sentiment. I use my grid transparency to line up my sentiments in my Misty. I know a lot of stampers that can line things up just by sight, but that is not me. I seriously need all the help I can get. So this grid transparency is really a lifesaver for me. So now I'm going to place my stamp on top of my grid sheet, lining it up to make sure that it is straight. It's actually fairly easy to line up now that I have the grid transparency there, and I can pretty easily see where the line would be. I'm going to pick it up with the lid of my stamping tool, and then I'll gently tuck my grid transparency underneath my Misty stamping pad just to keep it there. Then I know where it always is. Now that my paper's back in place, I can ink up my stamp. I'm using Altenew Crisp dye ink in jet black, and I'll just gently tap it over my sentiment and press down my Misty lid. Do this one more time just to make sure that I get a really crisp image, and then off screen I'll do the same thing for the second card. With all my pieces ready, I'm ready to start assembling my cards. I pre-make my card bases out of Hammermill Premium Color Copy 110-pound cardstock. I grabbed 2 of those and I'm just reinforcing the fold with my Altenew bone folder so I can get a really nice crease. Now I'm going to be attaching the pattern paper directly to my card bases. I had cut the pattern paper ahead of time to 3 3/4 by 5 inches, and I'm using my dot liner to adhere them. Unfortunately, the camera doesn't do the greatest job of showing the pattern in this paper here, but I think you'll get a good idea when we look at it in just a little bit. You can clearly see the pattern on the back side, which is absolutely gorgeous too. Just this front the front side, and it's more of a subtle pattern so you can hardly see it. Now that the card bases are ready, I'm ready to add some adhesive foam to the back of my stamp sentiment panels. I'm using double-sided foam adhesive sheets that I've already cut down. I buy my adhesive foam in larger sheets because I like my popped up panels to be firmly supported underneath, and well, I'm a bit lazy and I don't want to have to make my own. Of course, you can easily use any foam adhesive you might have in your stash. I'm adding the foam panel onto my card base, making sure to center it over my pattern paper. I followed the same process off screen for the second card, and now I'm ready to start arranging my flowers and leaves on the front of my cards. I'm going to start with the ink sprayed leaves and flowers, and here you can see I'm playing around a little bit with the arrangement until I get it kind of where I want it or how I think it should look. And then what I'll do is I'll put press and seal over the top to hold the pieces in place. I like using the press and seal because it allows me to remove the entire arrangement at one time, add the glue, and then place the arrangement back on my card front right exactly where I wanted it without losing the arrangement. I learned this press and seal technique from Jennifer McGuire, and I just think it's genius. I can't believe how much time it saved me, how much frustration it saved me. You can see here I'm pressing down firmly to make sure that my pieces, my individual die cut pieces, stick to the press and seal. And then I'm going to go through and add the glue to the back of my pieces. Once I've got the glue on, I'll turn the press and seal over, and I can see through it well enough to be able to place it exactly where I want on my card front. So I can turn it around a little bit, move it up or down until I find that place where I really want it to be. And it is liquid glue, so I do have a little bit of give. I have a little bit of time before it sticks firmly. Now you'll see here that I'm going to be leaving the press and seal on that card and set it aside while I do the second card. If I had any glue that had overrun, this would probably be a bad idea. But since I didn't have any glue overage, I was able to just leave the press and seal there, and it worked to hold the pieces in place while I'm working on arranging my second card. So here you can see I'm putting together the same arrangement on the ink blended card, just making sure that all the pieces are kind of in the same general place. It won't be exact, but it'll be pretty close. And I'm going to follow the same exact technique using the press and seal. So now it's time to remove the press and seal and reveal the cards. This is the ink sprayed card, and now we'll remove the press and seal from the ink blended card. And we'll go ahead and add a few drip drops just for some added sparkle, and then take a closer look at each of these cards. Let's look at the ink blended one first. I feel like this card is super soft and very feminine looking. It has a really peaceful feel to me. And the ink blended card is definitely more vibrant, much bolder in color, and also has some amazing contrast. And when you look at them side by side, I think you can really tell the difference that the two mediums had on these cards. But when I was looking at them, I was wondering how much the lighter background played into the feel of the card. So off camera, I created the flowers and leaves again, only this time I put them on a darker background. So these are both the ink sprayed cards. You can see that it's still vibrant even on the darker background, but it definitely has a different look. And these are the ink blended cards. And I think the ink blended ones pop a little bit more on the darker background and have a softer look on the lighter background. But I'd love to hear what you think. So please leave a comment and let me know which of these is your favorite. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I hope to have another video coming soon.